So you need to pay attention to everything that was brought to you, so that if you have some previous definitions that don't match the reality of what Dennis is trying to show you, you'll need to adopt his reality so that this entire webinar is of value to you. But the first thing that we always do in my webinars is I'm going to play you a little YouTube video of stuff about what my company does, just so that you're reoriented to who we are and what we do. So I'm going to start that now. Let's talk a little bit about how to fail and wind up paying the state of California tax that you didn't have to do. By not hiring me beforehand, okay, of course, I'm arrogant, I'm confident. The reason I'm confident is if someone hires us before they take possession and follows all of our instructions through the test period that they've chosen to use, they're not going to fail, okay? Recently, I became aware of a case that a lawyer sent to me, said, can we help? And it's scary on two fronts. One of them is, why didn't the guy hire me? And I can tell you why he didn't hire me. He made a decision based on price. He found somebody that would do it for less money. And second of all, they gave way too much information to the state of California. Those are two very fatal things. The tax bill is over $1 million. So what the state of California wants is over $1 million in taxes, penalties, fines, interest, whatever their socialist viewpoint is to steal your money. But the bill is over $1 million. And it doesn't have to be. Too much information was provided. And I can tell you from my point of view, someone inside the state of California is misapplying their own historical records, and they're misapplying what's applied through the IRS, which has nothing to do, if you look into California laws and regulations, there's nothing about this particular viewpoint, which I cannot divulge to you, okay, because it'll give them too much of a heads up. But they're doing it wrong. And my guess is they know they're doing it wrong. Why? Because they've been bullying people for years. And their answer is always, we've always been doing it that way. That's how the first functional use test was designed in the interstate commerce test. Someone just woke up one day and wrote something into life, and they say they've always done it that way. And I could prove to them that they didn't, but it didn't matter. It absolutely didn't matter. Whoever these people are, they can sit in their offices and just say, we've always done it that way, and you have to accept it. And as long as you know that the tax agency is willing to take that position with you, why wouldn't you protect yourself? You have to protect yourself. You have a duty and an obligation and a responsibility to yourself and your family and your company to not pay these taxes and fees to a completely corrupt government. That's my opinion, and I'm sticking to it. If you shop your tax consultant by price, why would you do that? You're going to spend $5 million or $25 million or $70 million or even $1 million on an airplane, and you're going to try to save a couple of $1,000s on your tax advice? It's, you know, unless you believe that you can finance the rest of your life by the amount of times you're going to win a lotto, it makes absolutely no sense. Absolutely no sense. And when you're dealing with a state agency like California, that at a whim, they'll change the way they look at information. Okay, and I guarantee you that happens every damn day. You have to understand how to communicate and how to deal with these people. And I will tell you that from my point of view, every aircraft that's had to pay tax was because of some information provided to the state of California by the taxpayer. So you have to understand how to communicate with them. You have to understand what information you're going to give them. If you take the viewpoint that they're going to shoot you and burn your house down and fuck up your wife and family and your kids and eat them for lunch Okay, you have to see that much danger in how all this stuff is. I'm not suggesting to you that anybody at the state of California would actually operate that way, but you need to get your mind right about how dangerous all of these interactions with any tax agency is. If you look at them like a voracious animal who wants to eat you, then you got to be more careful about what you do and how you communicate with them. You have to understand whatever their focus is, it's always got a common denominator regardless of what tax agency is. And that focus is they want your money. They think they're entitled to your money. They're socialists, okay? No capitalist would ever allow there to be any form of taxes, okay? That's just my opinion, but I'm always right. So, Dennis, are you ready? Here's the floor. This is Dennis Rousseau, and Dennis, you probably ought to introduce yourself to people and give them a little bit of the bio facts about you so that they'll know how bright and brilliant you are and why the message that you're here to deliver them today is extremely valuable to them.
Thank you, Tom.
So it's all yours.
Thank you. First off, I've been in the business for 41 years. I was en route to medical school, and I hooked up with the innovator of the condensed version of the cardiac pacemaker, who got me into helicopter EMS. And it was essentially providing EMS services to the offshore rigs utilizing twin-engine helicopters. From there, I got into fixed-wing EMS using the older Lear 23 series, and then got into aircraft management, aircraft sales, and right about 1989, I made the decision to go off on my own to help aircraft owners better understand the cost and the value of their asset. So with that said, I think what I'd like to do is roll right into the next slide here and start getting into a little bit of how aircraft posts came to be and what we do.
Dennis, let me interrupt you for a second. I forgot to tell everyone, we really encourage you to ask any questions you have. We have a text set up here in my office where you can send a message in and I'll relay your questions to Dennis. But please, this whole process of going through webinars is made more valuable when you add your questions to it. I apologize again, Dennis. Continue.
No problem at all. No problem at all. So in 1989, I went off and started a aircraft consulting group named TRC. Our discipline and our primary focus were to address the cost of operation on an aircraft, aircraft acquisition, long-term strategic planning, and aircraft value. Having contracted with a number of Fortune 50 companies, aircraft value was consistently brought up in terms of what's my aircraft worth. I call 3 brokers, I get 3 different answers. My response to one CEO when he asked me, what is my aircraft worth, was, I don't know, but I can find out. And I started going through various processes of how do we determine value. And at the time, we were dealing with a Lear 35. This aircraft was mid-time, engines were on programs. However, the fleet at that point in time consisted of some 470 aircraft. And the more I looked at the subject aircraft, the more I thought to myself, how does this really compare to the fleet? And without having any idea of what the fleet comprised, I was really taking a shot in the dark. So what I started to do at that point in time was develop this MarktoMarket methodology. And I determined at the time, first and foremost, I have to know my subject aircraft, and secondly, I need to know the fleet. How does my aircraft compare? And without delving into that element of our industry, again, I was just shooting in the dark. So having started down this path of mark-to-market valuation, I thought, geez, if I know what the fleet is, I know what the total time and landings are, I can now compare my subject aircraft to the fleet. The second step is to go into current market. What's on the market? How does it compare to the subject aircraft? What are the prices? And now, most importantly, what is selling, what's it selling for, and why? So keeping in mind that the internet overall is only about 20 years old as we know it today. So in the late 90s, as the internet came to be, I started formulating this plan, if you will, to bring data online and let the aircraft owners see it firsthand. So there is no question about the value. Here's how your aircraft compares to the fleet. Here's how it compares to current market. Here's how it compares to recent sales. This is what they're selling for. This is what yours should sell for, and these are the reasons why. That's essentially what it all came down to. So by the year 2000, we launched a company called Aircraft Valuator. For obvious reasons, we picked the A for Alpha, the C for Charlie, the V for Victor, actual cash value. We launched that using a very static operating system in the Microsoft family, and at that time we had 965 aircraft in our portfolio. Our target market to gather data were aircraft owners and operators. We would call them one by one. What's the status of your aircraft as it sits today? And once we had the original owner telling us, hey, we have 1,000 hours on the aircraft today, it's 10 years old, and we have 500 landings, it was very easy to draw the corollary and say, okay, you're flying 100 hours a year, and for each 2 hours that you're flying, you're landing 1 hour. That started building our algorithms. So right around 2000, we start gathering fleet statistics for many other aircraft, current generation aircraft for the time, G4, Falcon 900, the Challenger series. And as we're gathering the fleet statistics, we're asking the owners, what did you pay for your aircraft? When are you going to dispose of it? What would you hope to get for it, and why? So we're gathering all this data by serial number. And right about 2004, when the internet really started taking off, we decided to rebrand from Aircraft Valuator to Aircraft Post. We formed a IT department, and we went with open source code so we can manipulate the data to where it would serve our interests, and that was the mark-to-market value. So we started pouring all these fleet statistics into this system, recent sales, make, model criteria, select a broker. We started adding all these different features to not only service the owner and operator, but as well the OEMs, the brokers, the banks, the consultants, and so forth. And now as we fast forward from the early days, today, Aircraft Post, and keeping in mind that we started out with roughly 965 aircraft, today we have over 55 make models ranging from the Lear 40, Lear 70, CJ4, right up to and including the Gulfstream G650, comprising some 11,000 plus aircraft, 9,000 owners. And because of where we are today and what we've designed, we're able to generate residual values. We don't go out 10 years, 15 years, because no one has a clue what the markets are going to do. But what we can do with some semblance of reality is project values out 1 and 3 years to assist the owners in enabling strategic planning. And today we also have aspects of Aircraft Post to assist in that strategic planning, such as make, model criteria. You have one aircraft, you're transitioning into another. What is your budget for going into the next aircraft? Put it into Aircraft Post. What are you looking for in terms of operating parameters, range, cabin height, and so forth? It will search through the database of the 55 existing make models and come up with those aircraft that will meet your specific criteria. You can then go into the actual make model and actually build an aircraft to your spec, right down to the wood veneer. If you're considering selling your existing aircraft, we also have a feature, find a broker. So we've listed brokers that have had exclusive listing with a particular make model over the last 6 and 12 months and show you the performance of that broker. Where was the aircraft priced when they brought it on the market? What did it sell for? What was that delta? How long did they keep it on the market? And so forth. So we've really built in quite a bit of features that can really enable better informed decisions to the aircraft owner, operator, broker, OEM that's considering taking aircraft in on trade, and so forth. So what all this comes down to is say mark-to-market value. What is it? It's pretty simple. It's a process of valuing assets by the most recent market price. However, when we speak of selling prices, there are many variables that have to be addressed. And one of the most critical data points that drive our markets are one of economics. So let's begin with a couple of fundamentals, and we're going to start with Joe Consumer. And in the life of Joe Consumer, we think to ourselves, geez, you know, why would Joe Consumer affect the business jet market? Here's a family of five. The main breadwinner is making $150,000, $200,000 a year supporting his family. What goes on? Well, that does drive aircraft sales, believe it or not. So as the consumer starts accumulating debt through their life cycle, and albeit auto loans, mortgages, credit cards, and so forth, and these are all at historic highs right now, how does this affect our business? Well, as we're paying these Joe consumers to support their families and work for our companies, they're incurring debt, credit card debt, variable interest rates rise. What happens? We can't service our debt. Car loans today, and I'm going to be drawing a couple of corollaries between auto loans and aircraft loans, as well as auto values and aircraft values as we go through the presentation. But at the end of the day, we're looking at unprecedented consumer debt, and that does have an impact on our industry. Consumers stop spending. Why? Because they have a fear of where the economy is going, but yet they have debt to service. Now the companies that they work for are no longer selling the products because of this fear, this rampant fear in world economics. We have political changes, geopolitical changes. How do they impact what the consumer is doing? So today, what we're finding is as we approach the year 2019, we're getting into an area where we don't know where the economy is going to be going in 2019. So we look at business jet values now on the flip side of all this. What are the companies doing? They're standing back and they're saying, what's going to happen in 2019? Where is our industry going to go? How do the recent tariffs affect import-export? So from Joe Consumer, we're actually going to take this now and look at a much broader picture. And that picture is one of indices, economic indices. How do these various data points affect business jet values? Well, one of the things that we're going to look at is the Baltic Exchange Dry Index. And what that is simply is a benchmark for the price of moving the major raw materials by sea. It's reported daily by the Baltic Exchange out of London. So when this index goes down, it's telling us that the import-export side of the economic spectrum is starting to weaken. So when I go back to, hey, we can project values 1 and 3 years, these are the type factors that we're looking at. What's happening near term? And if the OEMs in our aircraft industry are cutting back on production, they're not delivering as many aircraft into service. These are all the indices that affect that. We can go into the next one. WTI crude. As the price of crude goes up, what happens? It's gasoline. It's affecting the cost of not only automobiles, but operational costs for our aircraft. As it goes down, does that mean we're going to see an increase in flying? Bear with me here just one second. Another index that we look at is the Dow Jones Industrial Average. And I'm going to show you why here in just a second. When we go back into 20 and 30 years of the business jet industry, back in the 80s and early 90s, we could pretty much peg what our industry was going to do based upon recessions. Because recessions were actually timed to happen every 7 years. 6 to 12 months prior to a recession, we would see aircraft inventory starting to build, prices coming down. During the recessionary period, we were flatlining, pretty much giving aircraft away. Then as we started to come out of the recession, inventories went away, prices stabilized. And that was the indicator that we used for business jet values. Fast forward, we get into the late 90s. We had a very stable period. And then the dot-com craze came along. Well, what we could do post the dot-com craze is that we could look at the Dow Jones and business jet activity, selling activity in particular. For the purpose of this demonstration this morning, we're going to be using a Gulfstream G5. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with our industry, aircraft basically come in three sizes, small, medium, and large. The G5 is in the long-range category, the large aircraft category, has a stand-up cabin, 6,000 nautical mile range, and it was one of the first aircraft that entered into our industry with a 6,000 nautical mile range. Up to that point, we were looking at best at 4,000 miles. Well, why was it all of a sudden that 6,000 nautical miles became the staple? Why? Because manufacturing costs in Eurasia became extremely low. So we're shipping all of our manufacturing to Eurasia to have the equipment or the whatever it may have been manufactured in Eurasia and then sent back to us so we can sell it here in this country. Now what we need to do is communicate on the ground, boots on the ground, so to speak, with these manufacturing elements. So we need aircraft that can go nonstop from North America to Eurasia. Great need for the G5 and its competitor, the Global Express. So these aircraft all of a sudden became the staple for long-range travel. And once again, we look at the values of these aircraft in the early 2000s, and they pretty much had this a similar trajectory, if you will, to the Dow index. So there is your direct connect to economic data, business jet values. And we pretty much follow those like clockwork right through about 2008, 2009. And then things started changing. We had this divergence. The Dow took off one way, and it actually increased, went from about 16,000 to where it is today, roughly 26,000. And we look at our business jet values, and we went from 18 million to 9 million. Opposite end of the spectrum. So now we have to deal with different dynamics. So in so doing, what information do we need that takes us from this antiquated ways and means of generating value to something that is going to bring some reality to the value of these assets today? So what we needed, just adjust this here. What we needed, in addition to the economic data, were the fleet statistics of these various aircraft. And in the case of the Gulfstream 5 and the Global Express, we followed them from the time they left the factory floor to the time they entered service, and then through their life cycle. And what we were collecting was the raw data of these various aircraft. The dynamic for business jets was total time and landings. Once a new aircraft buyer went through this arduous process of speccing the aircraft out, hiring the crew, hiring the maintenance personnel, placing the aircraft into service, there wasn't much that was going to change over the ensuing 5 to 7 year time frame. These assets had a starting price of $40 million. By the time you outfitted them and customized them, they were usually up and adding about another $2 to $3 million to the price. So by tracking these fleets from the time they left the factory floor, we could actually gather the interior configuration, equipment on the aircraft. We could look at current market as the aircraft entered the market. We knew that they had a price point of around $40 million new. What were they being priced at on the current market? And more importantly, what did they sell for? How many sold? What was the average time on the market? Tom, is there another way to flip through these slides? Here we go. I'm sorry. So as we go back, as I mentioned earlier, we used to use straight line depreciation, and we had very few indices in which we could capture data and draw corollaries between values and what was happening in the economy. As the economy increased, got better, business jet sales increased, values stabilized. What we used to use was a straight line depreciation over a period of 30 years. So we started out in the case of this aircraft at $40 million, thereabouts, and we're going to run it from 1998 right through 2028. And because these aircraft are depreciating assets, every piece on an aircraft has an expiration date stamped on it. Therein, it's making it a depreciating asset. So whereas we used to look at the useful economic life of 30 years, what's happened over the last 10 years with accelerated market depreciation, it's taken a big chunk out of the economic life of these assets. And now, as opposed to looking at a 30-year life cycle, now what we're looking at is a 25-year. So this rudimentary technology, if you will, of drawing a straight line and saying, okay, 3 to 4% per year, and we're somewhere in the vicinity of what this aircraft should sell for. That all went out the window right about 1998. With the dot-com boom, a lot started happening in terms of generating wealth. And we had a lot of these young fellows that were coming up with these great ideas. They had a paper value, if you will, of billions of dollars because they came up with this concept of garbage.com, as I like to call it. And I recall colleagues coming to me saying, geez, you know, you should really buy into this stock. It's called garbage.com and it just doubled. Well, why? What is the fundamental behind this stock doubling? No one could come up with it, but yet all these young guys are buying $20, $30, $40 million aircraft with money they really didn't have. And that sent our markets into this frenzy. So when we look at right around the year 2000, as these events are unfolding, we had a price of an airplane that started at $40 million. 2 years hence, this depreciating asset is selling for about what it sold for new. And when all the frenzy settled, what happened to the values? They dipped. And that was right about 2002. And then we look at the selling prices over the next 3 years. This is economic recovery right in here. And then the banks started giving away money. When that happened, everyone wanted an airplane. Everyone was out buying aircraft. Zero interest, we'll finance at 100%, in the hopes that these things were going to go up. And they did, falsely so. Now we go back up to the $37 million mark, right about 2006, 2007, then the market crash of 2008. And keep in mind, it wasn't just in the aircraft industry that this was happening. It was happening to Joe Consumer with mortgages. So the prices all went up, And as the old adage goes, whatever goes up must come down. If you're in a boom, you're going to hit a bust. And we did. We went from 37 million, which again, if we use this 30-year economic life, this asset should have been selling right in here at about $28 million, but it's selling for $8 million more. And this happened clear across the board. And almost overnight in the ensuing 2-year period, we went from 37 to 19.9. We lost almost 50% of what this aircraft had been selling for 2 years prior. And then finally, right about 2010, we start seeing a little bit of flatlining, and then we go back into this line of depreciation. And today, business jets are selling about 50% under what they should be selling for. Bear with me here. Okay, so let's go back to the mark-to-market process now, or procedure. Now that we have some of the fundamentals down and a little bit of history about what's been happening, we look at an aircraft that is near 20 years old, and again, we're going to just take a mid-serial number Gulfstream G5, long-range aircraft that sold new for around $40 million. 20 years hence, we're looking at a value, mark-to-market value of $9.3 million. How does that happen over such a relatively short period of time? And how does it also define what our markets are today? Well, once again, when we go back to aircraft, they're pretty well stock. And what I mean by that, out of the 193 aircraft that were manufactured from 1996 through 2002, every single one of these G5s came standard equipped, because they're all built on it based on a type certificate. They all came standard equipped with the following avionics. And keeping in mind, back in the mid-90s, when these aircraft were designed, we didn't have the luxury of the communication capability that we have today. The SATCOMs, the high-speed data in the sky. And I remember sitting at my desk thinking, geez, you know, I have this 5-hour trip ahead of me. Wouldn't it be nice if I could go online and be able to communicate with people while I'm traversing the globe? Well, lo and behold, today we have high-speed data. We have all types of SATCOM. You can leave San Francisco today and fly around the world and never leave touch with people. Back in the mid-90s, it was, geez, I don't think we'll ever achieve that. Well, we have achieved it. So every aircraft, and again, there were 193 aircraft built. About 35 of them have been delivered to foreign or domestic governments. And what really distinguishes the aircraft is a couple of different factors. First and foremost, the airframe hours and landings. And then secondly, optioned equipment. So every aircraft comes standard with the standard equipment, and now we can start adding equipment based upon our utility. What is the aircraft going to be used for? Is it primarily long-range travel? Well, if flight crews can only be up for 12 hours and can only be behind the throttles for 10 hours, but the airplane will fly 14, we have a fundamental problem. We're not going to be able to use the aircraft as it was intended unless we add a crew rest area. The reason I bring these points up is not only will the aircraft fit the mission today, but as well long-term. The average tenure for ownership of these aircraft is roughly 7 years. At the end of 7 years, I'm going to sell it, I'm going to get into something new. Now, what is that pre-owned buyer going to be looking for? What will the regulations, the air navigation regulations, our air traffic control regulations, what are they telling us we need to have in order to operate in today's environment? 10 years' time, a lot of aircraft are built and placed into service. How do we get them all up into that sky? Back in the late 80s, our governments came up with reduced vertical separation minimums. Instead of pushing 200 aircraft into this highway between, let's say, North America and Europe, now we're pushing 1,000 aircraft into the same space. How do we do it? We do it by installing equipment in each and every aircraft to where we can keep track of everyone, and air traffic control can keep track of us and guide us accordingly. Once we got through the RBSM stage, we thought, okay, we're all set for the next 20 years. Lo and behold, 5 years ago, we come out with another mandate, another regulation, FANS, Future Air Navigation System. How do we get even more aircraft up into this space? Those mandates, those regulations are actually building the aircraft of the future. What do we need to all fly into this same airspace? Will the equipment that was installed on our aircraft 10, 20 years ago, will it suffice for today? Chances are, no. So now we have to modify them. So when we look at the life cycle of an aircraft and we go back to when we purchased it and we outfitted it, and it took 1.5 years before it got into service, we had this aircraft outfitted exactly the way we wanted it and exactly the way that the airspace would accept us. 5, 10 years hence, we need more. Keep in mind, the value of this asset is going down. The cost of these mandates are going up. What do? So we look at our aircraft from 20 years ago, and we've outfitted this airplane the way we wanted it. We've painted it in our corporate colors. We've configured it to where we can flip these chairs around and make them berthable. We have a nice conference group back here for business meetings, a nice aft galley. The cockpit is fully equipped, and dual labs. When we paint our aircraft, we paint it to our corporate colors. We don't think of, geez, how is everyone else painting their aircraft, and what effect will our paint scheme have on value? Keeping in mind that about every 10 years, you're going to strip and paint this aircraft to the tune of $300,000 in 6 weeks of downtime. Well, one of the things that we do by compiling fleet statistics is that we're able to generate photos of each and every aircraft, current photos. How does ours compare? Again, we're only going to keep this asset for 7 years. If we paint it like this, and I'll tell you right now, that paint job changes colors as it moves along the ground and as it moves through the air. The cost of that paint job was $600,000, and it took 3 months to do. Now, to that existing owner, he's throwing $600,000 against a $10 million asset, almost 10% of its cost on a paint job. And because so much went into the design and the production of that paint scheme, come time to sell it, keep in mind, once that aircraft hits the pre-owned market, the first time, the tenure for ownership goes down to about 3 years. The second time, it goes down to about 2 years. And everyone wants things to look like their company logo or company color schemes and so forth. This aircraft right here is going to have a hell of a time being resold. So that's just one of the things that goes into value. As we buy the airplane and 7 years hence, we're going to sell it. When that time comes, how does our aircraft compare to the fleet? So we can place our subject aircraft next to the fleet of 193. And keep in mind, we're almost 20 years old now. We have, again, one of the major value data points similar to an automobile. Hours on an airplane, miles on a car. If I have a lot of miles on my car and I put it on the market to sell it, I have no knowledge of what these 2 million other cars have for miles. But if I have some sense of what other cars are doing, what other airplanes are doing, now I have a benchmark from which I can compare my aircraft. Some of the fractional providers today, when they put their aircraft on the market, they're going to be running twice the fleet average. So when you look at the fleet of 193 aircraft of 7,700 hours, and the aircraft was built from 1995 to 2002, you can do the math real quick. How many hours a year are most people flying it? Most people are flying it 450 hours a year. And then I come over here, and if it were a fractional aircraft, I'm looking at 14,000 hours. So once again, to draw that corollary between the consumer markets and the business jet markets, am I going to buy a car with 400,000 miles on it when everything else has 100,000? Probably not. Because as I accrue that time, albeit miles or hours, what's going to happen? My maintenance costs are going to increase. As I accrue that time on the aircraft, what else is going to happen? The value is going to come down. And I know that because we're tracking not only fleet statistics, but we're tracking current market and recent sales. So we can look at these data points either in the summary view, which we just did, or averages by year view. We have a 1999 with 7,700 hours on it, and here are the 30 1999 aircraft with roughly 7,500 hours on it. The other major dynamic that's going to affect aging aircraft are programs. Programs similar to term insurance. I'm paying X dollars per hour, betting that I'm going to live, betting that I'm going to die, and the insurance company that's issuing it is betting that I'm going to live. At any point in time, the costs are covered. Very similar to aircraft. When we look at engine programs, essentially what we're doing is setting up an account, and for each hour that we fly it, we're accruing monies that are going to be paid one day for a major inspection event. And in the case of the Gulfstream 5s, when you look at 20 years hence, the first major inspection on these engines was about $800,000, and it came due at 4,000 hours. So we can figure that if you're flying an average of 400 hours per year, 10 years, you're going to hit a major event. Then the overhaul came due 10 years hence. That event cost $1.5 million. Now, as the aircraft ages, what's going to happen? More parts are going to need to be replaced, which increases the cost. Today, a 20-year-old aircraft that's going to undergo an engine overhaul is going to run about $5 million. Keeping in mind that the value of this asset was $9 million. How do we reconcile that? And on top of it, we have these mandates that are coming due where we have to put another $1 million into the avionics just to fly in this airspace. Let's continue on here for a moment. Now we can also look at the fleet detail view. So we've looked at it, subject aircraft, how does it compare overall to the fleet? How does it compare in our vintage? And then by serial number. Serial number 502, 503, 504. So it's providing all the data that's necessary to determine where you're at and to be able to make well-informed decisions as it relates to your aircraft. So one way that we here, just one second. I'm having a difficult time following along here on my own presentation. So from fleet statistics, what we want to look at is current market. At any given point, how many aircraft are on the market? What are the asking prices? Not make offers, but what are the asking prices in dollars, US dollars? How long have these aircraft been on the market? And I apologize for this being a little fuzzy, but here's the total days on the market, the time on the market. Here is the mark-to-market value of where the aircraft should sell. Here are their respective asking prices. And then all the data related to the aircraft, total time, total landings, whether they're programmed or not. Paint and interior, how old are they? This particular aircraft here, the paint is 16 years of age. We know we're going to have to spend $300,000 if we buy it. So we've looked at fleet statistics. We know how our aircraft compares. We've looked at current market. The other thing that we want to look at, recent sales. What has sold in the last 6 months? What did it sell for? We see that 5 aircraft have traded. They've traded from $4.2 to $11.25 million. We look at this 4.2. Why? It only has 5,800 hours on it. So all of these various data points that we're looking at and the spread of 4.2 to $11.2 million, that's almost a 300% delta. Why? If we don't know these data points, if we're not familiar with them, how can we realistically bring our aircraft on the market and expect it to sell for a realistic price? Another dynamic that affects our markets. Competing makes and models. When the G5 came out, Bombardier also introduced the Global Express, 6,000 nautical mile airplane. We had a 3-zone cabin, meaning we had 3 living rooms basically. So each time an aircraft comes out, another OEM is going to pick up on the capabilities of the aircraft and build something similar. So we can stay in the markets. So Bombardier develops a 6,000 nautical mile airplane. Gulfstream develops a 6,000 nautical mile airplane. And right about 1995, 1996, these aircraft enter service. The price point new of the G5 was $37,600 without options. The price point new of the Global Express is $37,500 without options. Today, that same 1996 G5 is selling for $6.9. That same 1996 Global Express is selling for $6.1. And we can run the delivery numbers all the way out through end of production. We can do the same thing with the Global Express. What percentage have they retained over time and why? That's why it's critical that we understand the markets not only of our G5, but as well what has been selling in the last 6 months for the Global Express. Because if you're looking at the G5, you're also looking at the Global Express. When aircraft are built, the certification costs, in the case of a Global Express G5 type aircraft, you're looking in the mid-90s now. You're looking at R&D and development costs of somewhere around $500 million. Take that same $500 million and apply it to today's certification and development costs, you're over $1 billion. That's what it costs to bring this aircraft into service. Now, because of the high cost criteria and the certifying fundamentals involved in aircraft, how do we get or reap as much money, as much profit out of these aircraft as we possibly can over time? And not unlike a vehicle, if we have a Toyota Corolla from 1970 and we fast forward to today, if that same 1970 Corolla looked like it did in 1970, I don't think we're going to have many buyers. And the same applies to aircraft. We can only look at this Gulfstream for so long and the capabilities of it before our needs change. And also the capabilities of the aircraft are going to change because of regulatory concerns and other factors. But now when we look at the certification costs, what most of the OEMs are going to do is pretty much milk the initial type certificate of these aircraft and rebrand it into something else. So in the case of the G5, at the end of 2002 going into 2003, Gulfstream introduced the Gulfstream G550. The aircraft was built under the same type certificate as the G5. Bombardier did the same thing with the Global Express. They turned the Global Express into a Global XRS. What were the differences? Chances are they made very little difference in the wing, the fuselage, the empennage. The majority of difference is going to be in the cockpit and in the cabin. So going back to the G5 scenario, Gulfstream built 193 of these aircraft from 1996 through 2002, and then they started the G550, which has been a stellar success for the company. Unfortunately, they now have 576 G550s in service. And if we all wore blindfolds today, walked up those stairs and turned to the right and closed the cabin door, 41 years in this business, I would be hard-pressed to tell whether we're in a G5 or a G550. And both have a 6,000 nautical mile range. So now Gulfstream is nearing the end of production on the G550 as they introduce the new Gulfstream G600. Bombardier is doing the same thing, going from the Global 6000 into the 6500, where they're tweaking the motors, new interior, new cockpit, tweaking the wing. So we're going to try to put more life into these old airframes and continue to sell them under the original type certificate. And that is why when we come to data points like this, what we really need to know is also what's been happening with the G550, the successor to the G5. And when we look at price points, getting down into the $9 million figure, and this figure should be reading $9.6 million, keep in mind the selling point, price points of the G5. We were at 4.2 to 11, and now we find that we can buy a G550 with all the avionics capabilities that we need to meet this next mandate for about the same price point. It sends our markets into a bit of a spin. So when we look at the mark-to-market model, we not only have to keep in mind that we have our specific make model to look at, but also what's the competition doing and what happened once they ceased production on my aircraft. How do we keep apprised of all this? All these changes, all this market activity, up, down. The aircraft was selling for $37,500, now it's selling for half of that. Well, kudos to our company. What we're basically doing is that we put out email alerts, informational bulletins, if you will, to apprise aircraft owners and operators of what's going on in their market. Grant you, if you're in the widget business, you're not looking at the aircraft markets. You're looking at what the widgets are going to be selling for. How can we produce them cheaper, build them cheaper? How can we sell them for more? So one of the things that we found in this electronic world is that if we can take something and electronically send it to keep you apprised of values and what the markets are doing, it puts everyone on the same playing field. The problem with these older aircraft, as I've touched upon here a couple of times, is that we have not only aging aircraft issues, but we're also faced with economic and technological obsolescence. 20 years hence, our $40 million aircraft is now down to $8 million. The engines need to be overhauled, and we have mandates that need to be complied with that are going to cost another $1 million. And we need paint and interior. So we look at a $9 million asset, and we look at a capital outlay of $7 million. Where does that make sense? And in the same light, we look at technological obsolescence. The cockpits of the 80s, and that's this aircraft right here, a 1980 G3, this is all analog instrumentation. Then in the 80s, we moved into what's called EFIS. These are all first generation cockpits. There's a big long tube attached to this in the back end and big fans underneath this to keep all of this cool. Look at how we've just stuffed all this stuff into the cockpit. Now, as this ages, the original equipment manufacturer for this equipment had to support it for 15 or 20 years. At the end of that point in time, you're on your own. If it breaks, we don't need to replace it. We don't need to repair it. We're done with it. Figure it out. So independent third parties come along and say, okay, we can take all of this out and we can put in these LCD screens for only $1 million. But nothing has really changed down here. And then we come into today's operating world. This is the cockpit of a G5. Keep in mind, we have these 12-inch tubes hanging off these CRT screens. And what we need to do to accomplish today's mission is get more information into these computers. That's all we're doing. The big computer sits under here, and all of this is attached to it. We need to get more information, but the computers can't handle it. So we're going to change it out. We're going to put in LCD screens for only $1 million. Give you a larger computer. And then we look at today's generation. This is the G550. So this is the G5, G550. For about a $500,000 difference when these aircraft were new, you're going to get into the latest generation cockpit on the market. These are LCD screens. There's nothing behind here, and you have one computer running it all. Other technology that is becoming more and more in demand in our industry. This is what we used to look at many years ago when we would shoot an approach. All you see are the runway lights. And then right about 2000, the OEMs introduced enhanced vision system, where we're literally taking an infrared camera and now we can open up and see the taxiways. We can see the hangars. We can see the end of the runway. But no, we're not going to stop there. Let's continue. Now we're going to turn it into synthetic vision, where essentially you're seeing the environment as daylight 24/7, worldwide. So what do we need to store all these data points? We need a bigger computer, and we're doing it. We're integrating more and more information and data into these computers. To one day, and I know I'm probably crazy saying this, you're going to have a manager up front, period. He'll be pushing buttons, and there will be one person up there. What does it all mean to us? Well, as we introduce this technology and we find that we can go into airports that we previously couldn't go into, we want our older equipment, our older aircraft, to come into this operating environment. At what cost? It's a depreciating asset. As the value continues down and these mods continue to become more and more costly to make it a safer environment, pretty soon they equal or exceed the cost of the asset or the value of the asset. And at that time, we send them to the graveyard. At what cost? Mark-to-market value. We should have an entrance strategy. When are we going to buy it? What are we going to pay for it? And we should also have an exit strategy. And the only way we can have that is to have the information that we need to make informed decisions. And with that said, I'll open it up to any questions you may have.
I'll reiterate what Dennis just said. It's your opportunity to talk to someone who has an area of expertise that may or may not align with yours. So do not ever in this situation be afraid of asking what you think someone else will consider as a dumb question. If anything struck your mind here that didn't make any sense, it's your responsibility to get your confusion cleared. Otherwise, you're still in the fog that you're currently in. I'm not accusing anyone of that. I'm just saying that is how the human mind works. You have an opportunity to listen to what other people say, and information will become more valuable to you if you allow it to be assimilated into your mind. So, I have a question here. Regarding unique paint and or interior, you have a metric for the gap regarding days on market and the value of that gap.
We do have a metric that we use, not necessarily for paint, because that is more a function of every 10 years you're going to do it anyway. In terms of interior, we do have standard interior configurations for each of the 55 different make models that we specialize in. If you deviate from that, obviously you're going to have an issue, because now you're going to be looking for a buyer that has the same need as you did when you installed this miscombobulated interior. To redo
Here's a follow-up to that question. Excuse me for cutting you off, Dennis.
Okay.
For instance, if the uniqueness of the paint or interior, can you justify repainting or re-ragging prior to bringing the aircraft to market?
Yes. And what we will typically tell owners is that prior to bringing your aircraft to market, strip it, make it plain white, and let the new buyer have the option of putting 2 stripes on it. As far as the interior is concerned, there are some cosmetics that you can redo fairly inexpensively. One is the carpet. If you walked into a home that you were considering buying, and the carpet has tracks up and down it, and dog stains, chances are you're going to look at the whole house in that manner. That's the way it was taken care of. Same thing with an aircraft. You're going to have tracks going up and down the carpet. On these large cabin aircraft, for about $50,000, you can replace the carpet. So yes, there are things that you can do to bring the aircraft to the market to make it a little bit more marketable, for lack of better words.
From the same person who sent the original questions, he said he added with the goal of reducing the days on the market, and that probably is tied to the can you justify repainting or re-ragging prior to the bringing the aircraft to market. Do you have any comments on that, Dennis?
Yeah, you are going to reduce the time, absolutely, because we've seen aircraft that really have truly customized interiors and customized paint jobs. We've seen them sit, and if it's a market of 20 aircraft, they're probably going to be one of the last, or fall down to the last 20% that will sell into that range.
So I believe, this is Tom, this is my own comment. I believe, going back to what you just previously said about making sure that everything you do with your aircraft while you own it stays consistent with your goal of your exit strategy. Is that a major point you're trying to make here?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Absolutely.
All right. If there's anybody else who has a question, please send it in now. I see that we're a little over the hour mark, and I will continue as long as any of you who are on board watching this event need the opportunity to get your questions answered. Here's a question from another person. It says, the straight line depreciation versus the reality of depreciation and appreciation, were you able to provide a level of accuracy during 2002 or 2007?
Yes. First off, we take the market hype and we put it aside. And we make the fundamental assumption that the aircraft, because it is a depreciating asset, Gene, it will never exceed its original cost new. So in the case of this G5, for example, or a G550 that sold new for $40 million, and now because of the market exuberance was selling for $48 and $52 million, we never exceed, in the mark-to-market world, the original cost new. We may broach that point, but the chances of meeting that point are next to none. And again, we go back to what goes up will come down. And this market exuberance may have driven the markets up, but we also knew it was going to come back down. Once that happens, we have some data points in which we can extract that market acceleration or depreciation over that specific period in time. We take the aggregate and we put it into our algorithms, if that makes sense.
Here's a further comment from Gene. Had the pleasure of working with Aircraft Post when employed by TAG years ago. Excellent comparisons were provided. So there's a testimonial for you.
Thank you,
And
Gene.
you can, yeah, you can send your free Starbucks card to Gene later. I have no idea why we always want to make that kind of comment after somebody says something nice. We all work ourselves really hard to get those testimonials, because when we get them, we know that we achieved our goal of servicing our clients. So we shouldn't be afraid or make fun of our own successes. That's just my personal opinion, and I'm sticking to it.
Well, first off, how do you get access to the information? Do you value single-engine aircraft? We do not value single-engine aircraft by virtue of our price point for the service that we provide. How do we get the information? Once again, we start with a tech spec. So in the case of the, let's say the citation Latitude, we obtain a product specification or tech spec when the aircraft is first introduced. We follow it through entry into service, and then we start looking at the STCs that are developed and approved through the aircraft life cycle, and then we make the determination, is this something that's going to be adapted to the fleet, or is it simply a one-off? And once the fleet concentration gets to about 50% and starts exceeding 50% for a specific item, that's when it has value. But for me to come out today and say, you know, I'm going to paint the inside of my aircraft, you know, bright blue because that's what I like, and I know I'm going to be able to get my money back out of it, it's never going to happen. Never going to happen. But we obtain our information from multiple sources, and over the last 18 years, we've really had an opportunity, especially being that I've been in the industry for 41, we've really had an opportunity to build these relationships over time, and we're really getting into the owner archives now by offering them free access to current market data for their specific make model. So they can have access and stay up, and all we request is you provide data on your aircraft. So we try to stay as current as possible, and we're always out looking for new ways in which to obtain data. They call it data mining today, and then presenting it to our audience, to our client base.
I think we've about run out of time. I don't see any more questions coming through. Make sure, Dennis, that we have access to, people can reach you. I see your phone number, and I can tell, because there you go. There's what I'm looking for. Is the numbers are big enough on the screen that my old eyes will be able to see them. If you need any further information from Dennis, there's his contact information. I believe those are for you to use at any time. So make sure that you call him at 2 o'clock in the morning, because he really wants to talk to you. I'm watching. There we go. I was waiting for the smile on Dennis's face. So
thank you very much, Tom.
I think this has been enlightening for me, because this isn't something that I normally get into. It was a lot of information. There was a point at which I felt like I was being fed with a fire hose, but I've slowed down the flows, and I've kind of wrapped my head around when you got to the end of it and said it's important to have an exit strategy, I said, now all of this makes sense, complete sense to me. And it's not something that I think human beings normally do when they buy something. They typically buy with emotion, and then the logic of ownership and what am I going to do later kind of sets in over a period of time. But I thank you very much for the extremely valuable information you get. I'm sure that everybody who's been on board here feels the same way. So I'm going to say kudos to you. And at this point, I'm ready to sign off. Is there anything additional that you think needs to be said, Dennis?
We're good here. If you need to get a hold of me, or you'd like to have a discussion on mark to market, or I'm more than happy. This is what we do, and I am located in our Colorado office. We also have a New York office. So please feel free to reach out.
Okay. And I feel the same way. You saw, if you've been on for a while, or if you've been on this webinar, you obviously know that we stay in contact with you a lot. We move 1 million emails a month. We make 2,000 phone calls a week. So we're always reaching out into the marketplace. So if you want to be, if you feel left out because we're not calling you often enough, just give us your phone number and I'll make sure somebody calls you as often as you need. So it's been a great adventure today. Thanks, Dennis, for giving us what appears to be about 70 minutes of your valuable time. And I am signing off. Thank you.
Thank you very much.